Islamic authenticity. And the term Muslimism aims to reflect this individual-oriented nature. But more than being a label, I want to use Muslimism and promote it as an analytical category, because it brings with it a certain methodological thinking where, as scholars, we should focus our attention on the Muslim subject and his her doings, rather than the religious text or Islam altogether, assuming Islam to remote control Muslims in a way, creating almost this homogeneous actors, aims, and discourses. So what historical pathway did create Muslimism? Now this was an analytical historical analysis, really long, but here I'm going to briefly say, I argue that Muslimism is rooted in Turkey's transition to the neoliberal economy in 1980s, but this was more than an economic shift that undermined statism as well as Islamist establishments, created opportunities and a vacuum, enabling emergence of alternative religious expressions. So it created the infrastructure. And there were also transnational aspects such as markets were global and Turkey's EU perspectives and so forth. And it was a new Muslim bourgeoisie or an emerging Muslim middle class generated by the same neoliberalizing policies that formulated Muslimism. And we can trace the formulations of Muslimism in what I identify as cultural sites of hybridity. These are the sites in which Muslims experiment with Islam modernity amalgamations and produce new congruities or passages between Islam and modernity. And these are diffused into society. It could be markets, such as the fashion shows, Islamic hotels, and so forth. Civic associations, the HR example that I gave, political parties, such as the Justice and Development Party. Now, in order to introduce the content of Muslimism, I conducted a 2-year long empirical research, and I don't have time to talk about this table, but basically I mapped the Muslimist discourse to communicate its distinction, and I relied on the 3 Ds, din, religion, dunya, world, devla, state. And then I further differentiated each of those, but let's not get into that. Today I'm only going to introduce some of my data that pertains to their ontological design of states. So how do they view the state? And I anticipate it to be a liberal state. In order to conduct my research, I entered into what I identified as cultural, potential sites of hybridity. So I have Muslim there, an HR organization, Musiat, a businessman association, Capital Women's Platform, a women's rights organization, and the Justice and Development Party. The participants were only high-level members, that meant congressmen for the party, and for the rest it was chairs and counters and so forth. The data overall supported the expectations, which meant a new Islamic orthodoxy, what I term Muslimism, is emerging in the sites of hybridity. It's significantly different from Islamist establishments, liberal theologies, and that the study correctly identified its core elements. So let's talk about the data a little bit. The data shows that Muslimists articulate a liberal state design through contesting state secularism and also Islamic Sharia. Both types of states are seen to be equally oppressive and criticized for violating individual liberties. Now, it's really not surprising, given that Muslimism is a religious orthodoxy, that it contests state secularism. But what is interesting is that the target is not secularism itself, it's the authoritarian nature secularism is acquired in Turkey. And similarly, it's not a religious negation, it's a liberal political discourse that emphasizes individual liberties. And integral to this is a redefinition of true secularism based on a neutral and a pluralistic state. When we look at how they contest Islamic Sharia, we see that none of the participants actually either support the idea of an Islamic state, or do they think that Islamic state is necessary to establish a truly Islamic life. Now, you might think, to begin with, oh, well, maybe this is instrumentalism strategy, but the narratives show that this is actually rooted in theology. Because for Muslimism, a true religiosity emanates from self, some call this iman, the inner ethics, or qalbi, by heart, not from a policing state or a gazing community. So Daria from the platform says, you should be at a position where you can do both good and bad. If the state prevents you from doing misdeeds, this is not Islamic, because in Islam, you, as the individual, are responsible. Otherwise, if you tie someone's hands. So, as you can see, Daria's quote epitomizes how for the Muslimists, Islam is a matter of faith, and in fact, faith is a matter of individual, rational, inner, voluntary choice. This also brings us to the next point, where Muslimists theologically disengages the connection between state and faith, which is the opposite for Islamism, because in Islamist establishments, either the state or the community acquires a theological function to create an Islamic, a faithful community or living. As opposed to that, a congressman says, Islam does not talk about state institutions. Neither in hadith nor in verses can you find a precept like this. Religion was not revealed to the states. The state is not an addressee. For instance, our prophet does not tell us, go ahead, be presidents, prime ministers. There is no such claim. So, in consequence, for the Muslimists, Islamist faith can neither be attained under an Islamic state nor under a secular state, because both of them actually eliminates choice and limits individual liberties. One by imposing religion, such as the compulsory veiling, and the other by preventing religion, such as not allowing women to veil. So, Muslimists articulate a state design that would allow individual liberties and individual choice. And when they define their state model, they heavily rely on concepts such as democracy, rights, liberties, justice, and so forth. For example, Kadir from the platform says, contrary to an Islamic state, what's necessary is a democratic state. If democracy can be consolidated, everyone will have the chance to live their lives in accord with their own faith. They will have the chance to practice, this is important, their faith as much or as less as they choose. This is better than an Islamic state. So another feature of this Muslim state is its withdrawal from relatively prohibitory politics, and especially pertaining to social and moral issues such as alcohol and missionary activities. And again, we can talk about that later. To summarize the Muslim state, it respects individual liberties by extending the borders of political freedoms and withdraws from prohibitory politics. It also redefines secularism as based on a neutral and a pluralistic state, and it refashions secularism towards a democratic secular imaginary. Now, I want to also very briefly talk about how they perceive the West. How do the Muslims perceive the West? First of all, throughout the 3Ds, how much time do we have? Okay. Throughout the 3Ds, they challenge the Islamist dichotomy. They're globally oriented. They want to become global civil actors, having voice in HR, international issues, from HR violations to, sustainable growth, traffic murders, and so forth. And they use Iran as a negative case. They also ascribe Turkey a hybrid identity. Turkey is seen both Islamic and European, both culturally, historically, and geographically. They also promote a conciliatory politics, and the EU discussions are rather interesting because the EU membership in their narrative really intertwines nationalistic sentiments with globalist objectives. And why so? Because when Turkey gets into the EU, that makes Turkey a special model, so that's a very nationalistic orientation, right? But then this is considered for global peace, which is itself a very globalist objective. So it combines the both. This doesn't mean they are in love with the West. They're criticizing this at many points, from Iraq to UN human rights courts and so forth. But this doesn't result in an anti-global, anti-Western discourse because Muslimists embrace modernity while submitting it back to Islam. Two more things, yeah. So what are the implications? Actually, there are various implications. I'm going to talk about only two of them. First of all, this really challenges the IR divide between religion and modernity. The Islamic actors in this picture has not been rejecting, but actually promoting liberalism and democracy. And by using Muslimism as a case, as a lens, we can also identify emergence of similar movements elsewhere. And a good candidate is, of course, American evangelicalism, especially starting with 80s. My study in Muslimism also challenges the divide between politics and culture. Muslimism is not state-centered, but it reframes state purpose, polity, and political participation. Now, this is very important for policymakers here and academics as well, because Muslimism transcends cultural and theological demands into the political, right? So, where is this Justice and Development Party coming from? Where is this liberal national polity, this conciliatory foreign policy coming from? People tend to associate that only with political mechanisms, and they don't look at the broader transformations that actually inform the Justice and Development Party itself. So, in my argument, the party is not a cause of moderate Islam, but it's a product of this Muslimist emergence. The party's Islamic expression is rooted in broad cultural transformations that generated Muslimism in Turkey. This doesn't mean the party itself is Muslimist, and various factors can actually shift the party towards either a status or a fundamentalist turn. But then in that case, we would expect Muslims not to support the party any longer. That would do it for me.
Thank you. Dr. Burhanettin Duran from Istanbul Sehir University will comment on the presentations and then we'll open it for discussion. Thank you.
I'm actually a scholar, but not young any longer. So I have the excuse of sitting here while sharing my comments on the papers with you. In the first panel of this conference, we concentrated on Kemalism, national identity, education, gender, and the transformation of Islamism with the help of three wonderful papers. And I had the privilege of reading all the papers, and I'd like to thank all the panelists and SETA DC for providing us this opportunity. Yeah. And I know I have to face the challenge of trying to be brief in such a broad framework. Certainly, as a discussant, I'm not supposed to be presenting an alternative paper, though I have a strong inclination to do so. Kemalism is a topic as controversial as Islamism, and often the two are depicted as alternatives for the future of Turkish politics. Nevertheless, the definition and historical experience of Kemalism and Islamism are not monolithic. They are open to diverse interpretations. Interestingly enough, two issues, education and status of women in Turkey, constitute the major subjects of competition for both Kemalism and Islamism in order to define a new Turkish national identity. I start with Kemalism. Kemalism is seen as the first and so far unique successful experiment of secularization and westernization in the Muslim world. Although Kemalism is not a coherent intellectual and political framework existing in Atatürk's mind, its most significant ideological document is certainly Nutuk. As Matthew's paper shows us, it is still valuable to analyze, to study Nutuk in order to understand the transformation of modern Turkey. Why? Because all alternative isms in Turkey, including Islamism and Kurdish nationalism, make a reference to the times of the War of Independence to legitimize their claims pertaining to the nature of the regime. And Mustafa Kemal is the person who established the modern Turkey and at the same time wrote its history. Of course, with the help of his advisors. Matthew argues that in order to understand the linguistic and rhetorical construction of Turkish national identity in Nutuk, scholars should pay attention to some certain figures within this speech. Having inspired by Calhoun, Assad, and Foucault, he focuses on the nationalist discourse of Nutuk with a particular reference to the figure of religion. I believe that we need this kind of Foucauldian readings of various discourses in modern Turkey to delineate the ideological construction of national identity. His paper successfully outlines the stages and various discourses of the subversion of the sovereignty of the Sultan to the sovereignty of the nation. To further his study, I think that a comparison of Nutuk's discourse with its rival explanation of the War of Independence by Kazım Karabekir, Nizamur, and others will contribute much to our understanding of modern Turkey. Moreover, a research on the reproduction of Nutuk's discourses on the Turkish national identity throughout the history of Turkey might be interesting. I mean, in each military intervention, this discourse is reproduced. It would be an interesting thing to see how it is shaped and reproduced. Nutuk is the only discourse is not the only discourse about the foundation of Turkey, but of course it is the hegemonic one that will provide the very ideological basis of national education and indoctrination in Turkish public schools. Sarah Fischer, in her paper, shows us how Turkish education system is regarded as the means to create a national culture and to indoctrinate students in nationalistic gender roles. She illuminates the crucial role of education in legitimizing the state and the existing social hierarchy. She puts an emphasis on the significance of education and women's role as female teachers in the formation of modern national culture. In fact, women's dress have been a symbol of ideological struggle and ways of life between secularists and Islamists, where women are representing an alternative way of being modern. Similarly, a comparative reading of Kemalist and Islamist understanding of women's role within society would show that both reinforce women's primary roles as mothers. Sarah's paper